Hello. This week and for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be making videos, so in 3 parts, about art and labour. I will give the reasons for me saying labour rather than work in a minute. But I'm going to be focusing on cinema in this particular one, and then next week I'm going to be looking at art and labour with regard to poetry, and then the week after that I'm going to look at art and labour with regard to video games. It's the Niall O'Sullivan trifecta right there. And so, by way of introduction, if you haven't watched any of these before, hello, my name is Niall. I am a poet who makes videos and writes essays because the muse has abandoned me. And this week I will be talking about art and labour with regard to cinema. And there is a specific reason why I'm doing this, because I got round to watching the latest Wim Wenders film, or it should be Wim Wenders, I'm not sure. But I'll just keep saying it the Western way, which is Wim Wenders. And I will, even though obviously Germany's in the West, so the Northern European and American way, I guess. So I got round to finally seeing Perfect Days, and I've been wanting to see the film Perfect Days for a while. So if you didn't know about Perfect Days, it's a film made by Wim Wenders, and it's about a cleaner, a toilet cleaner who works in Tokyo. And it's just a film that shows, for most of its duration, shows his daily routine, which is in itself quite repetitive, in which he wakes up in the morning, spends the day cleaning toilets, then tends to either go to a particular cafe, restaurant, or maybe to a bar in the evening, does a few other things, goes home, goes to sleep, wakes up the next day, does the same thing. And I'd read about this film as it was getting a bit of buzz from the Cannes Film Festival, mainly because the main man in it, so the cleaner, who's called Hirayama, and he's played by Koji Yakusho, he was awarded Best Actor at Cannes last year. Or was it this year? I don't know. This is where the bit at the side comes to the rescue and corrects everything I say. So I'll probably make lots of inaccurate statements throughout this video, and I will probably forget to mention some actors by name and some directors by name, or I'll get dates wrong. So whenever that happens, this little handy empty space here, this dotty wall at the side, will ultimately help me in my endeavour by correcting me. So just keep an eye out for that whenever that happens. So he won Best Actor at Cannes, and it really seemed like my type of film. And in some ways it still is my type of film. And so I knew when I watched it, I thought, oh great, because when I was reminded of 2 other films. One of them I will talk about today, the other one I'm going to save for another time. So the 2 films I was reminded of when I read the synopsis for this film, and just the ethos of the film as well, which is the sort of Zen-like ethos of living in the moment, actually, and finding joy in each moment of your life, even when you're doing things that people might think are unpleasant. And so I was connecting it to the Jim Jarmusch film Paterson, which is I really enjoy watching that film still, and it has a similar ethos where the main character is living through quite a repetitive daily routine, but finding happiness and satisfaction through it. And then there's another film which is one of my, and I spoke about Blade Runner as my favourite film last week, but I think this one has equal claim actually to be my favourite film in other ways, which is Ikiru by Akira Kurosawa, and which translates as Living. There was a remake with Bill Nighy released last year, and the thing that connects all these films in one sense is that they're films that aren't afraid to show the viewer how to live. They're films about living and about how we can have a good quality of life that is often outside of what society tells us are the things that lead us to having a better life, be that maybe something like fame or extreme wealth or stuff like that. But actually, all the films are about making the most of the limitations of your life and finding joy within those limitations, but also finding meaning within those limitations as well. And so that was my plan. My plan was, I'm going to make a video and write an essay, because these things appear as essays on my button down as well, where I write through the same ideas that I talk through in these videos. And so that was going to be this week's brief. It was going to be art or films that show you how you can live, how you can live a worthwhile life. And I really enjoyed Perfect Days. I want to make that very clear, especially because I was watching it with that mindset But there was this little voice of dissent in my head. And, you know, much like we all are, the old Walt Whitman line, "So I contradict myself, I contain multitudes," that great line by Walt Whitman. And so part of my multitudes are, on one side, is that openness, the things that make me love Zen Buddhism, the things that make me love haiku and basho and the Chinese Tang Dynasty poets and Taoism and all this other stuff that I just really love, because it's about this openness to the moment that you're living in your life now. It's about no self, or if you're going via a more sort of Hindu Advaita way of seeing things, it's more of the self is everything rather than just one separated thing. I love all that, and I love art that goes in that direction. But there is another side to me, which is, I guess, the socially engaged side to me, the socially conscious side to me, dare I say, the woke side to me. And that part was also present as I watched the film. Now, I still immersed myself in the film. I really gave myself to the film when I watched it. And I think it's important to do that with any work of art. You can always apply your critical faculties to it. I mean, you can have critical thoughts about it as part of that immersiveness, but you can also always think about it afterwards and have a second viewing and stuff like that. But I do like it when I'm really trying to give myself to a work of art the first time I experience it, to try and come at it with less going on inside my internal monologue and more going on in just openness and experience. So this film was wonderful as an experience. I'm just saying that because I had other thoughts after watching it, and occasionally during watching it, about what it says about labour, about work, and about work in one way as something that's immersive and something that is, especially labour, where you can really lose yourself in it, but there is a satisfaction in the immersion of this work, while at the same time there's always another factor, isn't there, especially with toilet cleaners, and that is to do with the sort of the social standing of toilet cleaners, for a start, how toilet cleaners are treated in their working practices around the world, and other ideas such as alienation, like the Marxist critique that we might make. And that led me to change my strategy and to think, you know what, I'm not veering it as much as I wanted to make this art about showing you how to live thing. It was more about labour as it's depicted on film. Now, what do I mean by labour? I've said labour a few times, and I really mean it in the Marxist way, which is the work that we are given. So, you know, Marx particularly, he defined alienation. And alienation is ultimately when a worker is alienated from the product and the fruits of their labour. In other words, when the mill owner or the workshop owner is creaming a very tasty profit from their labour, and so they're not seeing the value of their labour at all, because someone else is sucking up all the value for themselves and hoarding it. And, you know, that's the point that's being made within workers' rights anyway, which is ultimately the whole point is they're not getting the full value of their labour. So people try and cast the kind of capitalist project as something where, oh, well, you work hard, you get the product of your work. It's all very equal and fair. And it really isn't. It really is pushed in preference of the people that already own property, that already have capital. And so that's what alienation comes from. I don't really want to go into it too much as well, but I think it's best for people to understand the political viewpoint I'm coming at it from as just your garden variety democratic socialist. Okay, so let me go back to Perfect Days. I think it's wonderful. I genuinely think it's a beautiful film. It had me under its spell for the whole 2 hours. Firstly, that performance as Hirayama by Koji Yakusho he's mesmerizing. He's absolutely mesmerizing. The final, there will be spoilers. I'm sorry. I know it's sort of, in some ways, it's not the kind of film that you can spoil, but there are a few plot developments that I will talk about that you might want as a sort of surprise when you're watching it instead. But he's mesmerising. A lot has been made of the final shot of the film, which is, it's just a shot of his face as he's driving his little van. And it's just this lingering shot with this music playing. and his face is somewhere between joy and grief. And I think when we are at our most alive in some ways, people think being alive is, I guess I am going in that direction of telling us how to live our lives now, but people often think being alive is just the moments when you're feeling absolute joy, where you're going woohoo like that. And I think when you're actually really alive is when you're wide open. And I think wide openness can have this feeling of tenderness, this rawness, there is a sadness that I think all empathy springs from, that's there at the same time as the joy. And that's what it feels like. It just feels like he's wide open at the end of the film, and he's transmitting and communicating that wide openness perfectly, to the point where I was very emotional while I was watching it. So let me go backwards to the film. What do I love about this film? I love it because I think it really does. I mean, most of his film is a man, or quite a few scenes in this film just consist of a man cleaning toilets. And I don't think we've ever seen a person cleaning a toilet and a series of toilets for as much time, for as much duration of a film as we do with this one. So there's something. So it's filmed in this 4:3 aspect ratio, or the Academy ratio as it's also known, which I think it might be slightly different to 4:3, but it's very close to 4:3. And because of this, when you use 4:3, the image feels very tall. So it's not so much that it's wide, but it's tall instead. And there's that boxiness to it. So we know this, the old cathode ray monitor or television had that aspect ratio as well, the 4:3 aspect ratio, or an iPad has that ratio too. And so when things are filmed in 4:3, they feel a bit more boxy, and that boxiness is perfect for showing Hirayama's life, which is he begins his day in this small apartment, which is a 2-level apartment, but I don't think he's even got a bathroom or a shower. I think he's got a sink where he brushes his teeth, he trims his beard, and he goes out he has his bath at a public baths, and after work. And he also eats at when he does, there's one scene where he does eat at home, and that's because he's given his cash for that particular day to his co-worker who's out on a date, and is trying to get him to sell his audio tapes so that he can keep the money, the little brat. But we've all been that 20-something-year-old as well. And so, well, I have anyway. And so he gives away his money, and then he ends up eating noodles in his apartment on that day. But otherwise he goes out to his favourite cafe, which is inside this precinct, where he has this drink that's a bit like a highball. I'm sure it's an alcoholic drink. It's got lots of ice in it, globes of ice as well. And so I've got a feeling there must be some kind of vodka or something in it, and it looks very cold and refreshing. And he drinks that, and then he has his dinner. And then he goes to a bar at the weekend where there's a woman who's about the same age as him, who runs the bar. They call her a mama, because I didn't know this until quite recently. That's how women who run establishments, that's what they're called. They're like the mother of the establishment. And I won't go into details about that particular plot line, but then he has a meal there as well, and he has the same drink. In fact, he has a couple of them, so he must have, I don't know if he has the day off the next day or something. His days are spent cleaning these toilets. Then, but he doesn't use technology much. He's got a flip phone that we only see him using near the end of the film. He takes photographs of trees with his film camera. He has a very basic sandwich for lunch. He listens to his audio tapes in his van. Those are mainly sort of Western rock bands and some soul music as well from the 60s and 70s. And he reads books, paperback books as well, that he buys from his local second-hand bookstore. As I said, the film looks amazing. Tokyo looks particularly beautiful. So when he's listening to these tapes going for a drive, we get these wonderful images of the city. And it really, that 4:3 tallness, the city, rather than this wide, expansive thing, it's this tall thing instead, which I think is always a really interesting compositional element. But there's the boxiness of his van, there's the boxiness of the cubicles that he works in as well. Now this is where I want to veer away, but I just want to again say it's a lovely film. It really is lovely. I love the performances. I think there's a tenderness to the film, and I enjoyed the experience, and I'm sure I will watch it again. And even though I have my reservations about some aspects of it, I want to make it clear that I loved it and I will probably continue to love it. Because I know some people have objected to the critiques I'm about to make but that's not the purpose of the film. That's not what the film's meant for. To the people that have made that critique of the critiques, I would just say, you've either done that kind of work or you haven't. Or you come from maybe a family that does that kind of work, or you don't. And to watch that film and not think of the other elements of this kind of work and the things that it feels sometimes are omitted by the film, that probably says a bit more about you and the own class dynamics you have perhaps operated within, if you didn't think that while watching the film. And I don't mean that as a you're a baddie, you're a nasty person type thing. I'm just saying this is why some people think about it, while other people perhaps completely are able to surrender to the aesthetic experience of the film and have that wonderful experience. So what little things led me to start thinking about labour and cinema instead of how to live your life in cinema after watching this film? There's a few things. And I think this is the first one's the easiest perhaps to dismiss, which is the toilets that he goes into are pretty clean. There's no, when you think about the nastiest toilet in Scotland in Trainspotting or something like that. But I think most of us that use public toilets know that at some point, no matter how well upkept those toilets are, someone's been and they've left it in a little bit of a state. And so we never really see that. We never see the fecal aftermath. The scatological aftermath of the visits of people that he goes in, when he goes in to clean. There's stray bits of tissue paper and stuff like that, but there's no human excretion in any point of the film. And I think that's a fair point to make. Is some people said, well, we can just imply that. And secondly, I get it that no one wants to go into a cinema, pay that extortionate cinema ticket rate that we have to pay right now, and then just watch on a massive screen some guy scrubbing away at a stubborn skid mark. I understand why they wouldn't do that. Okay, so let's disregard that. But secondly, I do also think Wim Wenders is from Berlin. Why doesn't he make a film following... He lives and works in Berlin, so why Japan? Why the Tokyo Toilet Company, which I will also talk about? Why do we follow this Japanese cleaner? Why did this German filmmaker have that decision? I'm not saying, I'm not being... Hopefully no one sees this as xenophobia. It's more, why is it that a German looks to that particular culture to tell this particular story? Is it because if it followed a migrant cleaner, because it would almost certainly be a migrant cleaner, I'm guessing, through a Western European or an American city cleaning toilets, would you be able to hold on to that same Zen-like quality? Or would we be up against other factors that butt against it? Meaning, really, that I don't think you can escape from the idea that Perfect Days is a film made about labour from a middle-class Western person for a middle-class Western audience. And the transposition to Japan, and of course the religion of Japan as well, be it kind of Shinto or Buddhist or that's a lot of Eastern religions, I should say, is that they allow us to have a different philosophical idea of labour and work. Most people who go on Buddhist retreats, will often sort of scrub the toilets and stuff like that as well, because that's part of the practice. So that's the first point about it, I think, the way it is presented as an aesthetic experience. Secondly, there's not much solidarity between Hirayama and his workmates. So there's this young man that he works with, a 20-something, who's kind of, trying to date girls. And he's your typical reckless young man who's obviously doing this job because he has to do it, doesn't really like the job, is turning up late, is unreliable. And there's not much, like, Hirayama hardly talks to him. So I'm guessing he doesn't like him. But Hirayama does give him money so that he can go on a date at the end of in the middle of the film. even though the young man still lets him down when he just gives up and quits the job later on. I have warned about spoilers and I will continue to warn about spoilers. But there's not much solidarity. There's nothing, he works in isolation for most of the film. There is a terse exchange between him and, I'm guessing, his superiors. In that sense, his management, when he complains about having to do the rota for the young man when he quits, they send a young woman who seems much more disciplined, dutiful and serious, and he's quite happy about that, to replace the young man. There's no sense of that camaraderie of workers. If anything, he's far more mute with the young man. He doesn't talk to a lot of people anyway, but he does talk to some people. But he's far more mute with the young man than he is with anyone else, with his co-worker. He's very separate to him. I should also add that the Tokyo Toilet Company, the toilets in the film are beautiful. They really are. They're architecturally beautiful. There's these amazing toilets partway through with these that are transparent, and then you close the door and they become opaque and of a different colour. And there's a brilliant bit where this English woman, uses the toilet, and she's a bit, what's going on here? How does this work? And then he shows her, closes the door, and then you hear the door lock as he's cleaning, and you hear her do this little squeal of delight, which is such a wonderful touch. And again, I really enjoyed the film. So the final part that really, I think, separates it in some ways, and I think maybe makes it a little bit problematic in that way, is that, final spoiler warning, but Hirayama's niece comes and stays with him. She's run away from home, and he puts her up for a couple of days. And while she goes to the bath, she's out a little bit later than him, so he manages to phone up her mother, his sister, and she turns up when they get home later on, and it's dark, and she's there in a chauffeur-driven car, and it quickly becomes apparent that he's from a wealthy family. Now, there does seem to be some trauma with regard to his father, and possibly the dementia or the illness that the father is going through, or we're not sure. But there certainly seems to be a bit of trauma there for him. But we find out that actually, no, yes, he's reading all these books, he's reading Faulkner, he's quite a cultured man. The mama at the bar calls him as a bit of an intellectual, and he dismisses it, oh no, I'm not. But it turns out, of course, he is from a wealthy background, so he's doing this by choice. This is something he's doing by choice, and that's that's the issue, isn't it? He's separate. I don't know if it's a case that he will, if he lost his job, he wouldn't be destitute financially. He chooses not to rely on support from his family, but maybe support might be available if things got really bad. But that's the big reveal. And again, I think I can see how it makes sense from one side of the film's argument, which is, you see, that's the value, because he doesn't actually have to do this, you see, but he does it because he really chooses to. But the flip side of that is, of course, is that there's that extra layer of separateness that he has with the working class, with the people that do have to do this job. And I think the film does well in a few things. It does really well, and actually there's a moment earlier on when he finds a child, returns the child to the mother, and the mother treats him like he's invisible. In fact, looks at him with disgust almost. There's no gratitude at all. And that's saying something about, the social classes, because she just sees him as a working class man who does a filthy job. And there's a point where also the sister says, is it true that you're cleaning toilets? Almost as if there's this shame and stigma attached to it. And he smiles and nods his head. But again, really nice toilet company. As I was going to say, these toilets are amazing. These aren't the grottiest toilets in Japan, for a start. And secondly, it's just that so many things, it's not really dealing with that working class situation. It further reiterates that it's a film that's been made for the middle class eye by a middle class filmmaker. It's for the middle class gaze. It's the immersion of work, which I think it captures beautifully, but it doesn't capture all of the other social aspects that surround that kind of work as well. It really avoids that issue. I don't know why, but I didn't write this about this in the essay, so I'll mention it now. Another thing I loved about the film is that I don't know why, but the scenes where he wakes up, I think it really captures. When people wake up in films, really, it's either or they go like that. The scenes where he wakes up, I don't think I've watched many films that capture the feeling of waking up. Maybe it's the zen-like quality of the film, the woozy intensity of sudden consciousness. It really captures that. So I'll end that on a bit of praise before I move on to the other stuff. Why am I moving on to other stuff? Because it begs the question about other films, other art, which I'll look at in future videos, but other films that deal with the issue of labour in different ways. So let's go back to that middle class labour for the middle, working class labour filmed by middle class people for the middle class eye. Roma from, was it 2018? Yes, 2018, which, again, I liked aesthetically. Alfonso Cuarón, the director, is an amazing director, and particularly he's a brilliant director of set pieces. And also visually, his films were always fantastic as well. And it stars Yalitza Aparicio as Marina. I'm reading this off my iPad, so I apologise for bad pronunciations. And Marina is a cleaner. Now, I think there's a few things. It's set in 1970, and Cuarón has based it on his own memories, and he came on a cleaner that lived who worked in his house. And he comes from a middle class background, and so there's no pretending there, at least he's not disguising that. But it ultimately follows this cleaner around her life. And I think it's a brilliantly filmed... there's one scene, spoilers, sorry, but there's one scene where a riot happens, but it's a typical, Cuarón, who's done these one-shot camera like Children of Men, which is brilliant, and also deals with class issues. But he's got this particular thing where sometimes there's one shot that captures a massive, brilliantly orchestrated set piece. And the set piece in this particular film is a riot happening, I'm guessing in Mexico City, but it's viewed from a department store. And actually, I'll say one thing in praise of this film. There's many things I can say in praise of this film, but one thing I find really interesting about that scene is that that's when the main character, she's pregnant and she miscarries. The family, I think, are buying her a pushchair or something. I have not seen it for years, and I didn't watch it again in preparation for this, so I'm going completely by what's locked in here. And then at one point, her old lover, who's actually the father of his child, comes in and he's pointing a gun, and it's almost implied he might kill her. The trauma of what happens leads to her miscarrying the child. And I mention this because I think, before I critique the film too much, I think it's almost like the pregnancy is a metaphor and the subsequent miscarriage are a metaphor, albeit it's a terrible trauma that the character goes through in real life and in the film, but many people go through in real life. But I also, because of it happening at the same time as the riot, I almost felt like it was like it's almost like there's a revolutionary spirit that builds up and then collapses, and it felt like a metaphor for a failed revolution to me. So I felt that if that was the case, that's a politically astute observation about the film. But perhaps my main critique of the film is that the way in which the characters are portrayed, and they're all acted really well. So this comes with the script writing and the direction, really, rather than something I would pin on the actors. And that is that the middle class people are complicated and contradictory and neurotic and all of these other things, and having to deal with these moral crises all the time. The middle class characters, complex, all dealing with all these issues, neurotic, multi-layered. Working class characters, either these mute, subservient people, or if they are revolutionaries, they're these silly, toxic males. So one of the first shots we see of these revolutionary men is him practicing fighting with the staff, and he's naked. And so, of course, oh look, I'm holding this long thing while I'm also fully frontally naked. Is this a symbol for something? So it's almost like the revolutionary spirit is just dismissed as toxic masculinity. And then there's this working class femininity, which is completely passive at the same time. And the characters don't go much further than that. It's not to say the performances aren't brilliant, but it's just, it doesn't go much further than that. And I sometimes wonder if this is the intention. I don't know. Right at the end of the film, she rescues some children from drowning from her family. She's still grieving her miscarriage, and then the family surround her, and that's the image on the poster, and they say, "We love you, we love you, we love you" to her. And then the next moment she's just doing the ironing again. And that's quite on the nose, and I was thinking that must be intentional. That must be a point that's being made here. So, moving on from Roma, are there films that get it right? And I think now, interestingly, I've already had some really interesting feedback about my essay, which you can see on my button down, link and everything, but there, link in the description, but also it's there. And that is that actually I've ignored lots of world cinema, and I know I have ignored lots of world cinema, particularly films made in the old communist countries as well. And I can't speak from that much knowledge of them, to be fair. It's more I've seen stuff like Milos Forman's old films, but I'm not that knowledgeable, and that's a really fair point about how labour is portrayed in those films. I'm guessing the alienation of labour isn't portrayed because that wouldn't be allowed in a communist country, but the immersion of labour and the value of labour probably is portrayed because of it being good propaganda as well. So, but it's something I don't know about, and that's all speculation, and so I don't want to present that as anything. I don't want to present anything I say as authoritative, really, but especially not that. So let me move on to some Western filmmakers that I think perhaps address this better. And that is one film I definitely think of is Ken Loach's Bread and Roses from 2001. And I think that's a film because it's about janitors, particularly the Justice for Janitors campaign of the 90s, and it's about janitors working in an office building in LA, and the staff they're not unionized. A lot of the staff are not in the country legally, and so they're being exploited. There's the foreman who is the company man, who is incredibly vicious and incredibly cruel with his staff. The main character, Maya, who's played by Pilar Padilla, and her sister, Rosa, who's played by Elpidia Carrillo, who was in Predator. I didn't know that until this morning when I was looking her up. So Maya arrives in the country. She's smuggled into the country. She manages to escape from her smugglers after some financial... after her sister is not able to pay fully for her entry into the country, but she manages to escape. And so she's cleaning, and it's a job that she's told lots of people want, but ultimately the exploitation is soon apparent as part of the job, and the way in which worker solidarity has been crushed as well. And of course the people that own the building are very rich. The companies that use the buildings are very rich. So what is it that I like about this film? He really trusts his actors, and some of the scenes where it is just two actors sat there at a table talking, the naturalistic performances, he really trusts them. And I've always felt this. When I first saw Kes when I was a kid, when it was on TV, I was really struck by how natural the film was, and wondered at moments if it was a documentary, because it felt so realistic, the way people were talking to each other. And I think that's something that Ken Loach has always had. I think he has that trust in his actors, but he can capture the natural quality of performance, and that sometimes means not being too showy with the cinematography, things like that, staging things in a much more standard, plain way, so that we really are connecting with those performances rather than marvelling at the cinematography, for instance. And I think there's points in the film where actually he does capture that immersion of labour. There's a wonderful scene where Maya is being taught by an older African-American woman. She's there with her Hoover, and she's sort of just she's just really frantically pushing the Hoover around. Sorry, vacuum cleaner if you're American. We I know Hoover's a brand, but we in the UK just say Hoover. And the wire's getting in the way, and then this woman sort of shows her, and she goes, it's like a dance, and she shows her the grace of the immersion in the labour, and it's like, you're dancing with your man, she says. It's your man, she keeps saying to her. And she's got the lead out the way, obviously, as well, so that she can push the vacuum around. And it's take it slowly as well. It isn't really about that immersion, that hypnotic immersion in labour. It certainly is a film that deals with those issues, those particular issues, and I think even does so in such a way that really is considerate of a working class audience as well. And I think it aspires to be watched and to inspire a working class audience. I just think that most of the audience it normally gets is a middle class audience instead. So other films about labour, I think about Factotum, and I watched Factotum about 2 months after quitting my gardening job, after about 9-10 years, and that was in order to go on a tour as a poet. It's, yay, great. So the tour and a few other jobs that I had lined up were going to make me enough money to live on for 6 months, and then if I had to go back to the yard with my tail between my legs after those 6 months, at least I had a good shot. And just things in different ways have worked out for me that I've not really had to do that, and I've managed to kind of do other things even when my career as a poet has sort of gone. And by the way, the last day of my job, content warning here, you might find this a bit disturbing, but when you're a gardener and you're cleaning around public parks, especially when you're strimming, there is a hazard where if you hit dog poo with a strimmer, it kind of explodes over everywhere, including you. Yeah. And my last day on the job, after all those years, was the first day that happened. And I'm going to spare you the disgusting details, but let's just say I knew what the last straw literally tasted like. Sorry. And I just remember turning off a strimmer, putting it on the back of the van. I was working my notice at that point, but I just walked into the office going, you know what? I'm done. And I walked out. And they were kind of cool. They said, that's okay. We'll pay you up to the end of the month. Thank you very much. They were actually cool. They were thankful for all the years that I'd given. So I watched Factotum, and I certainly recognised the earlier days of that work, especially days where there were points when I didn't have a job and I was in London and I just had I needed to work straight away, and the only work that you could get was the agency work, and it was mainly me and a group of, I wasn't an office temp. It would have been office temping, which I didn't do anyway. My background was in gardening at that time. I worked at a theme park. I can't tell you which theme park it was. I can only say that everything there was made out of Lego for a few years, and then I went to London and I was just looking for another gardening job, and I had to do I did the bin men round, I did other jobs, and they finally got me a gardening job, and I worked rubbish wages, and then they took me on full time and things were a little bit better. My main point actually is that I don't even know if I was capable of working in an office at the time if they'd have had me in the office, but I didn't want to work in an office. I didn't like that kind of work. I would have been like a chimp in economy class. That's how I would have been. Factotum is a film about it's an adaptation of the book by Charles Bukowski, following his fictional character Henry Chinaski, who's played by Matt Dillon in this film. The film's made by a director called Ben Hamer. He's playing Bukowski before he made it as a writer, and so he's writing during his days. He's going to the bars, he's going to the horse races as well and gambling, and he writes in his spare time. And obviously he wants to be a writer. He wants to be a professional writer, I should say, because he already is a writer. And he wants to escape from these jobs. And these are jobs that he just drifts through. So there's nothing really about that kind of immersion in labour. Labour is really very much portrayed as something that is killing his spirit. I won't spend too much time on that. I remember watching that film not long after I finished doing the kind of work I'm talking about. But another film which I think is similar and almost goes there in some ways, almost covers all bases, is Paterson by Jim Jarmusch. And what I like about Paterson is, unlike Chinaski in Factotum, Chinaski is just writing because he wants to escape. He doesn't like the work. Whereas in Paterson, the main character called Paterson, who works in the New Jersey city of Paterson, played by Adam Driver, he writes poems in his off time, during his lunch break, just before work when he's about to start up his bus. And you can tell that he loves his job. He actually likes driving his bus. He has a degree of solidarity with his co-workers. He's writing poetry, but he's not writing poetry because he wants to be a big famous poet. I saw one person who wrote a critical review of Perfect Days talking about Paterson and about how Paterson is not satisfied with his life. It's like, no, you didn't watch the same film, mate, because I've watched that film a number of times. He is satisfied with his life. He likes his life. It's more the chaos when his routine is slightly disturbed that he's less happy. His wife, played by Golshifteh Farahani, she wants him to copy his work, photocopy it and send it off, and to preserve it. And spoiler alert, the chaos moment comes because her dog, her English bulldog, basically chews up all his poems near the end of the film. And it's presented momentarily as a kind of tragedy, he's lost all his work. But then at the end of the film, he just starts writing again. And the point the film is making there is He's like the child who doesn't care about their drawings being thrown away. You know, he's just alive. He's writing his poetry. He's living his life, and he's actually very satisfied and happy. And it is a film that shows you how to live. And he does have solidarity with other people, other working class people, people at the bar that he works at. He doesn't work at. Sorry, he goes to a bar. He takes his dog out for a walk and has a sneaky one beer, and then talks with the fellow patrons. So he's an introvert, but he's not a loner. So he will have a little moment of human company before he goes back and maybe does more of his writing or whatever. And I think the film shows that immersion of him in his labour and his bus driving. Does it fully capture that feeling of alienation, that feeling of exploitation, perhaps as Bread and Roses is about? Not really. Bus drivers, I think it's what bus drivers are, at least a unionised profession. I guess I'm getting to the end of it. So there's a point I'm making here. Ultimately, is I think as far as Western film is concerned, the issue really is that there is a studio system. It's tricky, but lots of films criticise capitalism while at themselves being, objects, capitalist objects, you could say. Often they have to use irony, perhaps sometimes, to do that. Filmmakers don't have a choice. They have to make compromises. I really do understand that with all art. So they'll even make sort of films that fetishise poverty almost in some ways for a liberal audience, or present someone doing this kind of work as a stoic sage. And I think that's what Paterson and Hirayama are. They're stoic sages. They're these almost impossible figures that we all aspire to be when we just want to be happy with our lives. But in some ways it's just as difficult to be that kind of person as it is to be the person who wins millions at the end of their film, that kind of thing. So I do understand it's tricky, and I think that a Western film, how successfully can a Western film straddle that balance between something that has to be for a particular audience, while at the same time showing something which is, one, the immersion of work, while at the same time showing the social conditions of that work as well. I can imagine that a film from the studio system will never be able to do it, but each film will get close in its own way. So Bread and Roses is a film that will draw attention to those labour issues, while at the same time Perfect Days is a film that will really portray that hypnotic immersion in work that I think a lot of people go through. For instance, when I was a gardener, I used to love pruning roses, and my old foreman, they'd all found out I was a poet by then, but my old foreman would say to me, "Oh, you're thinking about your poems when you're doing that," and I really wasn't. My mind was completely empty. That's why I loved pruning roses. I quite liked it, not having to think about poems. That was something for me to think about on my commute home, or when I got back and sort of, started writing. It wasn't something that was in my head then, and I think Perfect Days really captures that feeling really well. So maybe we just have to satisfy ourselves with combinations of the two. But here's my big dangerous idea that I finished my essay with, and I'll finish this video with it as well. I like Joel Haver, the guy who does a few things where he just tends to make films with his friends, and they're cheap, no-budget movies, and he posts them on YouTube, and he makes some interesting videos about the snobbery he faces, about how it's not real filmmaking if you film something and then make a 40-minute feature and post it on YouTube. It's not a real movie and shouldn't be considered as one. And he's been advocating against that approach. And I bring him up. Obviously, I don't see Joel Haver as some big working class icon, but what he does advocate, which is people taking the means of production into their own hands, whether they're using a phone or anything. You film something, you edit it, you post it on YouTube. And so maybe we don't get someone making a film about working class lives, the immersion and satisfaction of work, while at the same time the contradiction of the exploitation that often underpins that. Maybe that's not going to come from the studio system. But you know what? A lot of cleaners, even some of the poorest cleaners, have, as they say, a movie camera in their pocket, and they can capture things about their life. And I think, and they could also post it on YouTube. Now, I know that having something to edit and editing software is a different thing. You can use some cheaper hardware and even a cheaper program to cut it all together. I'm just saying that the means of production for making art in many ways have become more available. And so sometimes production values is used as a way to try and distance us from the idea that we can't make art, we can't make films, we can't make movies. And maybe that's where it's going to come from. Once we get over this thing, and that's why I mentioned Joel Haver, because at least he's advocating He's advocating for kind of people making their own work and saying, sod it, I made a movie. Maybe someone will film real elements of their life and create a guerrilla film from it. Maybe they'll fictionalize certain points, but they will film the real details of their life and then edit it together into a compelling narrative. And maybe that's what we need to have. I'll be talking about poetry next week and how poetry was a way in which working class people, once publishing itself got more democratized. So when, for instance, like the mimeograph revolution happened, when poetry wasn't something that was gatekept by university presses, when the other ways of publishing your work, even making a fanzine with photocopiers, working class people were suddenly making their own art, poetry-wise, and distributing it. And maybe we haven't quite got to that point yet with the film camera, with the phone as a film camera. But I think we will at some point. I think someone's going to do something really interesting. It's not me. Too late for me, as Darth Vader once said to Luke Skywalker. But I think someone, I got a feeling, watch this space and all that kind of thing. I reckon it will happen. So that's the end of this one. It was probably really long again. I don't know. I'll be editing it down, I'm sure. But I'll be back hopefully in the week if I get the chance, because sometimes, this whole filming thing relies on a lot of factors. I'll always post the essay, but the filming, if one thing goes wrong, then I can't do it. So hopefully next week's video I will be able to make, and it will be about poetry and labour. And then the one after that will be made about video games and labour, because I love films, poetry and video games, and so that's why this channel and my button down essays are mainly about that. I will leave it there. Thank you for watching. Again, it's great to have already been corrected from the essay about things that I've missed out on, such as communist cinema. But maybe you've got some opinions as well. Maybe you've got some films that I've missed out on that you can point out. Maybe you've got suggestions for poets that I might talk about next week as well. Or video games that I might talk about the week after that. And also, I've got to say, I guess I'm becoming a proper YouTuber now, because I'm going to ask you, hey, if you enjoyed this, then please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and share it if you would like as well. I'm saying this because it really does help. You know all those YouTubers who say it really does help? It really does help. So if you can, there it is. Just got to click it. It's not much trouble, is it? There we go. Well done. See you next week. Have a good one. Cheers. Bye-bye.